April 15th, 1945. The afternoon sun filtered through scattered clouds above Lower Saxony, casting uncertain shadows across the heath. Lieutenant John Randall's jeep rolled to a halt outside what appeared to be a military compound. The air carried something thick and wrong, a sweetness mixed with decay that made his driver cover his mouth. They had stumbled upon this place by accident during reconnaissance, following a road that curved through pine forests and open moorland. A sign read Bergen-Belsen. Neither man knew what waited inside. Within hours, soldiers of the 63rd Anti-Tank Regiment crossed the threshold of the gates. What they discovered would become synonymous with humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty. Approximately 60,000 prisoners remained alive in the camp, though barely. Another 13,000 corpses lay unburied, scattered across the compound like discarded refuse. The British soldiers, hardened by years of warfare across France and Belgium, found themselves unprepared for this arithmetic of atrocity. Major Dick Williams, among the first to enter, would later describe it with brutal simplicity as an evil, filthy place, a hell on earth. The camp had not always been this charnel house. Established initially in 1940 as a prisoner of war facility, Bergen-Belsen transformed in 1943 when the SS converted portions into a concentration camp. It began as an exchange camp where Jewish prisoners with foreign connections might be traded for German nationals held abroad. But as the Reich crumbled and Allied forces pressed from all sides, the camp became a dumping ground for evacuees from eastern camps. Between January and mid-April 1945, approximately 35,000 people died there, victims of typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, and starvation. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Taylor, commanding the 1st British unit to assume responsibility for the site, walked through what prisoners called Camp 1. 6 blocks separated by barbed wire, each containing roughly 100 overcrowded huts. Some barracks had bunks, many did not. Prisoners lay in the open, bodies so emaciated that their humanity seemed almost abstract, geometry of bone beneath translucent skin. Taylor noted in his official report that internees wore striped prison uniforms or rags, many without shoes, walking slowly with vacant expressions on their starved faces. The documentation was clinical, necessary, but it could not capture the sensory assault of mass death and disease concentrated in one place. Among the structures still standing was a military hospital building, requisitioned by the SS, where German medical personnel had remained under the terms of the negotiated truce. The Wehrmacht commandant, fearful of typhus spreading beyond the wire, had approached British headquarters under a white flag on April 12th, explaining the epidemic raging inside. A 48-hour ceasefire established a neutral zone, while control transferred to British forces. This pragmatic arrangement left certain German staff in place temporarily, including nurses who had worked in the camp's so-called medical facilities. The British medical response began with shocking inadequacy. In the first 48 hours, only one field hygiene section operated inside, consisting of 1 doctor and 28 men, alongside approximately 200 non-medical soldiers from the 63rd Anti-Tank Regiment. The Royal Army Medical Corps urgently requested reinforcements. Water bowsers arrived within a day. Field ambulances and casualty clearing stations followed. But the scale of need dwarfed available resources. 17 British doctors, 12 trained nurses, and 16 voluntary aid detachment nurses faced tens of thousands of critically ill prisoners. It was in this chaos of insufficient manpower and overwhelming suffering that Private Thomas Beckett encountered the woman. She wore the grey-blue uniform of a German military nurse, dirty now, her face hollow with exhaustion. He found her in what remained of the hospital ward, surrounded by prisoners too far gone to save. The stench was unbearable. Bodies that still breathed lay beside those that did not, all tangled together in what one medical officer would describe as masses of people who had died slowly and painfully of starvation and disease, writhing in agony, helpless in puddles of excrement. The nurse's eyes met his. She spoke no English, He spoke no German. But in her hands she held a morphine syringe, and she gestured toward the dying prisoners around her. Her meaning required no translation. The gesture said what her mouth could not form in his language. Please, do it. End this suffering. They are beyond saving. You have the power to grant them mercy. Beckett stepped backward as if struck. The woman's face held no cruelty, no trace of the sadism that had defined the SS guards now being rounded up for interrogation. She looked simply desperate, human, confronting an impossible situation with impossible choices. Perhaps she believed she was requesting an act of compassion. Perhaps she could not comprehend that to the British soldier before her, her request represented everything his nation had fought against for 6 years. The British military ethic was clear. Orders from Brigadier Hugh Glynn Hughes, Deputy Director of Medical Services, emphasised saving every life possible. Feed the prisoners carefully, as rich rations could kill stomachs shrunken by starvation. Decontaminate them through the human laundry. Spray them with DDT powder to kill lice carrying typhus. Transfer them to proper hospitals in the nearby Wehrmacht barracks. Document everything. Prepare evidence for war crimes tribunals, but above all, preserve life. Yet the nurse's request exposed the terrible mathematics of triage. With 17 doctors and limited supplies, who would receive care first? Those with the strongest chance of survival, logically. The ones already too far gone. Skeletal figures whose internal organs had begun to fail, whose immune systems could no longer fight the typhus consuming them, would die regardless of intervention. In the barracks, British medical students who arrived in May discovered 600 or 700 people crammed into huts designed for 60, lying on floors covered in excrement, too weak even to move. Death remained a constant visitor, claiming 300 to 400 people daily in the first weeks after liberation. Beckett shook his head. The nurse's face crumpled. Perhaps she misunderstood his refusal as judgment against her specifically. Perhaps she understood all too well that he represented a different moral framework, one that rejected her premise entirely. He walked away, leaving her standing among the dying, and reported the encounter to his commanding officer. The British Army's response to such requests, when they occurred, was absolute rejection. Orders were orders, save lives, period. Even when saving seemed futile, even when prisoners begged for release from agony, even when medical students fresh from London universities found themselves unable to provide adequate pain relief or nutrition or basic dignity. The directive remained unchanged. Life must be preserved. The Nazis had decided who would live and die. The British would not replicate that calculus, regardless of circumstance. History records that German medical personnel at Bergen-Belsen varied widely in their complicity. Some SS doctors and nurses actively participated in the neglect that killed tens of thousands. Others simply failed to resist the system. A few attempted what inadequate care they could provide with almost no resources. The woman who approached Beckett remains nameless in this account. Her identity merged with the broader historical record of German medical staff who witnessed the camp's final weeks. Whether she had facilitated atrocities or merely observed them, whether she felt guilt or simply exhaustion, the documentation does not say. What is documented is the British determination to demonstrate a different path. By April 16th, food carts arrived with enough for every prisoner to receive an evening meal. Medical teams established protocols for feeding the starved, learning through trial and fatal error that the initial approach of providing standard British rations had killed an estimated 2,000 people whose digestive systems could not process rich food. Researchers from the Medical Research Council developed specialised refeeding techniques. Medical students worked 18-hour shifts, moving between barracks to distribute carefully measured portions of milk powder, rye flour, and oatmeal. The death rate slowly decreased. From 300 to 400 daily casualties in mid-April, the number fell below 100 by mid-May. Still, more than 13,000 former prisoners died in the 3 months following liberation. Their bodies joined the tens of thousands already dead. victims of systematic neglect that British law would categorise as crimes against humanity. The Special Military Tribunal convened in Lüneburg between September 17th and November 17th, 1945. 44 defendants stood trial for crimes committed at Belsen and Auschwitz. Among them, Josef Kramer, the camp commandant who had remained when other SS fled during the ceasefire. Irma Gräse, the notorious female guard known for casual brutality. Elisabeth Volkenrath, the head wardress. Fritz Klein, camp doctor who had presided over conditions that violated every principle of medical ethics. 11 received death sentences and were hanged in Hamelin in December 1945. The trials exposed the bureaucratic machinery of death. Kramer's plea for clemency to Field Marshal Montgomery argued he had simply followed orders, that his superiors in Berlin ignored his requests to stop the transport of prisoners into an already overcrowded camp. The defence was rejected. The tribunal determined that individual moral responsibility could not be abdicated to the chain of command. Those who enabled mass death through active participation or deliberate neglect would face justice. British QA nurse Molly Budge, who served in the relief operation, later described the extraordinary challenge of maintaining professional medical standards while surrounded by the evidence of their violation. She and her fellow nurses worked to feed starving infants, tend wounds that should never have existed, provide basic hygiene to people who had been deliberately kept in filth. They faced the ethical complexity of treating former guards for typhus while prisoners continued to die. The moral clarity of wartime combat did not extend into the aftermath of liberation. Every decision carried weight. Private Beckett never saw the German nurse again. Whether she was arrested, interviewed, prosecuted, or simply sent home when her services were no longer needed, the records do not specify. Many lower-level German medical personnel were eventually released, considered less culpable than SS guards and administrators. Others disappeared into the chaos of post-war displacement, their fates unrecorded. What remained with Beckett was the memory of her face, the desperation in her gesture, the impossible request. In the decades after the war, when clever people suggested that concentration camp horrors were exaggerated propaganda, Beckett could close his eyes and summon that image. The morphine syringe, the dying prisoners, the woman's plea for him to do what she apparently believed was merciful. He understood, as the months passed and perspective accumulated, that her request revealed something profound about the moral corruption that had infected even those who believed themselves compassionate. The request was impossible not because morphine was unavailable or because ending suffering was inherently wrong, but because the entire framework of the question was corrupted. It assumed the British would adopt the German calculus of who deserved to live and die. It assumed that mercy could be administered through killing when the real mercy was fighting to save every life, regardless of probability of success. It assumed that triage meant choosing death rather than choosing who to save first while working frantically to save all. The British choice at Bergen-Belsen was not perfect. Mistakes were made. Some of the harshest criticisms came later from military historians who noted the prosecution was hasty, that many SS guards escaped justice, that not all German medical personnel were adequately investigated. The decision to allow Hungarian guards to remain in charge during the first days resulted in continued violence against prisoners trying to reach food stores. But the fundamental ethical stance remained clear. Life was sacred, even life that seemed beyond saving. By May 21, 1945, the last prisoners had been evacuated from the original camp. British engineers burned the remaining barracks to prevent disease spread, filming the destruction as evidence. The flames consumed the physical structures, but not the memory. Bergen-Belsen entered historical consciousness as shorthand for Nazi atrocity, its imagery shaping global understanding of the Holocaust. Anne Frank and her sister Margot had died there in February or March, just weeks before liberation, their loss representing the countless individual tragedies that comprise the camp's death toll. The site became a memorial visited by generations of British soldiers stationed in Germany during the 70 years that followed. On November 14, 2014, the 7th Armoured Brigade, the famous Desert Rats, held their final parade in Bergen before transformation into an infantry unit. The local German military commander presented them with a Fahnenband, a ceremonial streamer marking decades of reconciliation and friendship. The gesture acknowledged the distance travelled from the horror of April 1945 to a relationship built on mutual respect and shared values. This transformation represented its own answer to the nurses' impossible request. The choice was not between mercy killing and cruel prolongation of suffering. The choice was between a worldview that categorized human beings as disposable and one that insisted on the inherent worth of every life. Between a system that bureaucratized death and one that fought, however imperfectly, to preserve humanity even in its most broken state. The British soldiers who liberated Bergen-Belsen carried its memory for the rest of their lives. Colin, who accidentally discovered the camp while fixing a motorcycle puncture and spent the night in the SS barracks, did not speak of his experiences for 50 years. The trauma ran deep. Oliver Sutton, Methodist chaplain who helped bury the dead, wrote in the Methodist Recorder that these camps must not be left out of thinking when dealing with the German question. They are facts, he insisted, not propaganda. The liberators understood something essential. The request to participate in killing, even killing framed as mercy, represented the final temptation of the system they had fought to defeat. To accept that premise would be to validate the fundamental logic of the camps themselves, the notion that some lives could be weighed and found wanting, that efficiency and pragmatism justified the ending of suffering through death rather than through healing. Private Beckett's refusal was therefore not cruelty disguised as principle. It was recognition that the woman's request, however sincerely meant, emerged from a moral universe that had already collapsed. A universe where medical personnel administered camps that killed through neglect, where the preservation of life had become subordinate to other considerations, where the Hippocratic oath to do no harm had been replaced by calculations about who deserved limited resources. The British alternative was imperfect. People died who might have been saved with more resources, better planning, faster response. The death rate remained horrifically high for weeks after liberation, but the principle held. Every life mattered. Every prisoner received care to the extent possible. Every death was documented, mourned, and attributed to Nazi criminality rather than accepted as inevitable. This stance had practical consequences. Nearly 100 medical students from London hospitals volunteered to work at Belsen in May, providing direct patient care in conditions that traumatized them permanently. Several contracted typhus themselves. One British medic was killed during a Luftwaffe attack on the camp. The commitment to preserving life required sacrifice from the liberators, not just rejection of requests to participate in death. The deeper meaning emerged over time. Bergen-Belsen became evidence not just of Nazi atrocity, but of the moral clarity required to oppose such atrocity effectively. The British did not defeat fascism through mirroring its methods. They defeated it by insisting that human dignity and human life retained value even when everything suggested otherwise. Even when prisoners were so starved they appeared barely human. Even when disease made recovery unlikely. Even when limited resources demanded impossible choices about who to treat first. The nurse's request, "Please do it," asked the British to abandon this principle at the moment of victory, to accept that mercy could mean killing rather than healing, to agree that some suffering justified death rather than demanding every effort at relief. The refusal was therefore not simply following orders or maintaining military discipline. It was a fundamental rejection of the ideology that had created Bergen-Belsen in the first place. In the decades that followed, survivors rebuilt their lives. Some emigrated to Palestine, to America, to Britain itself. Others remained in the displaced persons camp at Bergen-Belsen until 1951, waiting for countries to accept them, for paperwork to process, for the world to make space for people who had survived the unsurvivable. Their presence testified to the value of the British choice. These were lives saved, however broken, however difficult their continued existence would prove. The story of Bergen-Belsen's liberation contains no simple heroes. British soldiers made mistakes. Some of the medical interventions initially caused more harm. The war crimes trials missed many perpetrators. The displaced persons camps that followed liberation were themselves far from ideal, with survivors living in former Wehrmacht barracks, waiting in bureaucratic limbo, while democratic nations debated immigration quotas and security concerns. But amid complexity and imperfection, one principle remained solid: the rejection of death as solution. The insistence that life, even life diminished by suffering and trauma, retained value worth fighting to preserve. The understanding that mercy meant healing, not killing, even when healing seemed impossible. Private Beckett's encounter with the German nurse lasted perhaps 3 minutes. The moment of her request and his refusal was brief, lost among thousands of similar interactions between occupiers and occupied in those chaotic days. Yet it crystallized the essential choice that defined the Allied response to Nazi genocide. Would they respond to systematic death with more death, even if framed as compassionate? Or would they insist, against all practical considerations, that every life deserved the attempt at saving? The answer shaped not just the immediate aftermath of liberation, but the post-war order that followed. The Nuremberg Principles, developed in the trials that followed Bergen-Belsen, established that individuals bore responsibility for crimes against humanity regardless of orders received. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, affirmed the inherent dignity of all people. The Geneva Conventions were strengthened to prevent future atrocities. These legal and ethical frameworks emerged from the clarity purchased at Bergen-Belsen and camps like it. The clarity that came from seeing the logical endpoint of a philosophy that weighed human worth and found some lives expendable. The revulsion that drove the British soldiers, however inadequate their immediate response, to reject participation in any system of managed death. The German nurse who made the impossible request was likely not a monster. She may have believed sincerely that she asked for mercy, that ending suffering justified the means, that pragmatic acceptance of inevitable death was simply facing reality. But her request revealed how thoroughly the Nazi system had corrupted basic moral intuitions, how ordinary people, faced with extraordinary horror, could come to see killing as kindness rather than as the ultimate violation. The British refusal was therefore not judgment against her personally. It was recognition that the framework of her question was itself the problem. That any system accepting the premise that some lives could be deliberately ended to spare suffering inevitably led back to the camps, the gas chambers, the mass graves. That the only defensible position was absolute commitment to preserving life, even when preservation seemed futile, even when suffering appeared unbearable, even when resources were desperately inadequate. This commitment cost British resources time and emotional trauma. It meant watching people die despite every effort. It meant living with the knowledge that better planning, faster response, more supplies might have saved additional thousands. It meant carrying guilt for the imperfections of the relief operation alongside pride in its fundamental ethical stance. But the alternative, accepting the nurse's request, participating in mercy killing, however it was justified, would have validated the premise that had enabled the Holocaust: that human worth was conditional, that suffering justified death, that pragmatic calculation could override moral absolute. The British soldiers at Bergen-Belsen, often young men barely out of their teens, faced this choice in its starkest form and chose correctly. The memory of Bergen-Belsen endures not simply as evidence of Nazi evil, but as testament to the moral clarity required to oppose such evil effectively. The piles of corpses, the walking skeletons, the overwhelming evidence of systematic cruelty demanded response. The British response, however imperfect, established principle. Life was sacred, healing was possible, hope was justified even in the face of near-certain death. That principle, tested in the hell of Bergen-Belsen and upheld despite every practical consideration arguing otherwise, became foundation for the post-war order. It informed international law, medical ethics, human rights doctrine. It provided the moral authority that allowed allies to judge Nazi criminals, rather than simply executing them as enemies. It demonstrated that victory over fascism required not just military superiority, but ethical clarity. The impossible request, "Please do it," thus became in hindsight a defining moment. Not because of its dramatic impact, for the moment passed quickly and was recorded nowhere in official documents, but because it crystallized the choice that determined whether Allied victory would mean anything beyond simple conquest, whether defeating the Nazis would also mean defeating their philosophy. Whether the world that emerged from the war's ashes would be built on different foundations or would simply replicate the same logic with different perpetrators. Private Beckett's refusal said, different foundations. It said, life matters absolutely. It said, we will not become what we fought against. And in that refusal, repeated by thousands of Allied soldiers in similar moments across occupied Germany, lay the possibility of a different future. Imperfect, certainly. Still scarred by the evil that had been defeated, but different in its fundamental premises about human worth and human dignity. The heather still grows on Lüneburg Heath. The memorial at Bergen-Belsen stands quiet, visited by tourists and students, and the decreasing number of survivors who can still make the journey. The barracks are long gone, burned in May 1945 to prevent disease spread. Only memory remains, preserved in documents and photographs and the testimonies of those who witnessed liberation. And preserved too in the principled rejection of mercy killing, however it was framed, however desperate the circumstances. The understanding that the choice was never simply between quick death and prolonged suffering. The choice was between worldviews, one that measured human value and found some lives expendable, and one that insisted every life, no matter how broken or diminished, deserved the attempt at saving. One that accepted death as solution, and one that fought for life even when fighting seemed futile. Bergen-Belsen taught this lesson at terrible cost. 60,000 survivors, 13,000 additional deaths after liberation. Tens of thousands more who died in the final months before British arrival. The mathematics of atrocity are hard to process, each number representing an individual life cut short or forever damaged. But amid the overwhelming evidence of human capacity for evil stood the countervailing evidence, human capacity for principled resistance, for choosing the harder path, for refusing compromise with the fundamental premise of genocide. The nurse's request asked for compromise. Please do it. Accept that some lives are not worth saving. Accept that mercy can mean killing. Accept that pragmatic calculation overrides moral absolute. The British refusal to compromise, maintained at great cost through weeks of overwhelming suffering and inadequate resources, demonstrated that defeating fascism required moral victory as much as military victory. Required standing for principles even when circumstances made those principles nearly impossible to maintain. This was the true liberation of Bergen-Belsen, not just the opening of gates and provision of food, but the insistence that a different ethics was possible, that healing could follow horror, that life could be chosen over death, hope over despair, humanity over efficiency. The German nurse, making her impossible request, represented the last temptation of the system British soldiers had fought 6 years to defeat. Their refusal represented the possibility of something better emerging from the ruins.